Should work now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful event, especially to the organizers for putting this together. I've seen the program and I think it's very exciting and yeah, great opportunity for all of us to get together, even if it's online. Hopefully at some point we will be able to meet personally. So I put here my website, just in case you want to know a bit more about me, my lab and my research, but you can also send me an email if you have questions or if you just want to chat. I'll be happy to do that. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about task-specific vision DNN models for explaining different areas of the visual cortex. And I want to introduce you this task of object classification first from computer vision perspective, because since I'm going to use DNN models, I also want to give you a hint of what the DNN models are solving and how then we can relate this to the brain to trying to understand how the brain makes sense of an image or the world to see and make sense of it and know which object is present, for instance. So we can call this object categorization or object classification, and we can ask the question, what is in this image, or which object is in this image? So here you see examples of a data set that's called ImageNet. I'm sure most of you have heard of it because it's pretty famous now, and actually this is what started the spark in DNNs these days, even though DNNs go back many years. So here I just want to introduce you a bit, very briefly, different architectures of DNN. So all of these, this is the one that won the challenge of ImageNet in 2012, and then especially in computer science, everything started again looking back at DNNs to solve computer vision tasks and other kinds of tasks as well. But then there were other architectures proposed with many more layers, so going deeper. I hope you are familiar with DNNs, but mainly this is stack of neurons with some parameters encoded, and the tendency is to go even deeper to get more accuracy. Okay. So here you can see this competition that I was telling you about. So before 2012, nobody was using DNNs, even though they existed, but they couldn't make it work as nicely as today. But then in 2012, this was the first DNN that was used for this data set. And then since then, so DNNs is deep neural networks, especially convolutional neural networks were used. And then this is error. So the error was going down and now it's even lower. And here you can see some of the names of the architectures. I just want to put it here so you can see. So this one is without a DNN. So this was another kind of model that was used, computing some features and some, machine learning techniques to do it, and then all the rest. So improving these DNNs. And here you have human performance. I am not 100% sure that this human performance is really comparable to the DNNs, how it was done, but it's just for a reference to see that now at the behavior level, DNN seems to be better than humans at recognizing which objects are in the image. So now let's go the other way around. So most of you probably also know that convolutional neural networks were introduced as a model or as an inspiration of how the early visual cortex work, or the visual cortex in general works. With the early discover of Hubel and Wiesel with the visual cortex of the cat. There are very nice YouTube videos that you can check if you haven't seen them. I think it's amazing how you see this, the cat, and then you hear the neurons spiking when he sees some oriented bars and so on. So it's really nice. So now the DNNs work so nicely with very high accuracy. They have been used to explain the brain data. So first, DNNs were kind of inspired by the brain, then they developed independently of neuroscience or computational neuroscience, and now they are back, okay? And it's kind of trending now to use them to try to understand what's encoded in the brain and how the brain can make sense of the information to then be able to, in this case, for instance, disentangle what object is in the image. Okay, so also trying to understand the cognitive process behind it, but in a computational way. So here you see an example of one of the early works after the DNNs have been hot in computer science. And this was also very remarkable because the amount of variance of the data that could be explained with these DNN models, which actually was the same that won the challenge in ImageNet that I was telling you before, was incredibly much more than the models that have been developed specifically to explain the brain. Okay, so this also was kind of a discovery in a way, right? So these models are so powerful that can also kind of explain the brain. So what are the computational principles behind? How can we make sense of this? Is it the objective function or what is that? So after this, same people and others have developed also challenges to explain brain data with models. So you can have leaderboards, so you can submit your model. You can also submit your data if you have data, and people can compare in a kind of benchmark the different models and how they can explain the data. So of course, this is more towards predicting rather than assessing if it's biologically plausible, but of course the two things are kind of entangled and you can go from one question to the other. So if one model predicts better, so what are the computational principles that are different from another model that explains not as good, and then maybe we can from there do more experiments and see what's going on. And actually, I've also been involved in a similar project, which we call the Algonauts project. The first time was in 2019. We also had a break because of the situation and the pandemic. And this year we are starting again, as I will tell you later. So we also proposed a benchmark with data, and then people could submit their models. And we were using fMRI and MEG. So the main difference between this one and the other one is that we use here human data, and the previous one that I showed you is mainly from macaques. So now that these DNNs are very hot also for brain, not only computer science, so we can also go further and ask, for instance, a question as the following: can we assess functions of a brain area by comparing the correlation of its responses with a large set of diverse models trained on different computer vision tasks? So up to now, most of the DNNs that have been used have been trained on a single task, which is object recognition when participants or animals are looking at images. It has also been used for other sensory modalities like audio, for instance. And then, of course, you cannot do it on object recognition on images, but you have to adapt. But we have a lot of DNNs in computer vision that have been trained on in many other different tasks and not only object categorization. So can we use those to understand and have a deeper understanding of the different brain areas of the different brain areas mainly? And here I'm talking about correlation, you will see, because we used RSA, but one could use also encoding models, which are more predictive. So here you see the photos of my collaborators and Chiti's PhD student. You can also reach out to him. if you have questions. So along these lines, I'm going to present 3 different works that we did if I have time. Otherwise, I will just present a couple of them and then I'll leave the other one as an incognito. So the first one is for selective brain regions explained with scene parsing DNNs. Okay, so what is that? First of all, what is scene parsing? So scene parsing, you can see on the bottom middle an output of a DNN that is trained on a scene parsing. So here, instead of just delivering what object is present in the image, it delivers this information for each pixel. And not only for objects, but also for other stuff like walls, floor, ceiling, and so on. Okay, so you have more of a structured information of the scene. And what we did is take data from one of our collaborators, Mike Bonner, in which he collected some fMRI data of people looking at indoor scenes to then understand how the information was encoded in different brain regions. So here you see EBC, early visual cortex, OPA, PPA, and RSE. These are the place areas. And then he proposed some behavioral model that you see here. So it's his early work. And what he did was ask some other participants, not the ones that he recorded the fMRI data from, to outline in the image where are the paths where you can navigate. Okay, because the hypothesis was that OPA was encoding navigational affordance more than PPA. So PPA is usually known to encode more the kind of scene it is. Okay, and then he found that this is the case. So here you see how he did it with this behavioral model. This is how he found these correlations. So what we did instead is take the DNNs and find these correspondences and see if a model that was encoding semantic segmentation, so this is scene parsing, each pixel with its information, instead of the kind of scene, or even comparing to the object categorization, which is a kind of different task, could explain better the brain data. So we use RSA. So here you have a kind of croquis showing you how RSA works. I don't know if everyone is familiar. So usually you can compare brain data with model or behavioral model, and you build a representation dissimilarity matrix for either your model or the brain data that you have, so a particular brain area or a particular voxel in the brain. And you take the lower triangular part or the upper one because it's symmetric, and then you compare you compute some similarity score. Okay, so if you have questions later on about this, you can ask me, or you can also refer to the literature, or it's also explained in the paper a bit more detail. This is kind of like a bit more technical. Anyway, so this is very useful. Why? Because you can have a similarity score at the representational space. So of course, the model space and the brain space is different. And even it could have, in more technical perspective, like different length of representation and so on. So how to compare it? So you can do it with these RDMs. And here behind it, the intuition is that if in the space of the model, 2 instances are close to each other, and in the brain space are also close to each other, or the opposite, they are far apart to each other in a similar way, then it means that both representational space are similar. Okay. All right, so again, with our hypothesis, so a scene parsing model, since it requires understanding of the spatial layout, it would predict the brain responses better than a scene classification model, okay? Because especially for navigational affordance, but also to understand the structure of the scene, you need to also have encoded in the model the actual structure. So for navigational affordance is intuitive. You need to know where you can navigate, for instance, and also to understand the structure of the scene, so where the different objects are located and so on and so forth, okay? So again, here you can see what the output of a scene parsing model gives you, okay? So different labels for the different pixels, and here it's just one category, let's say. So we used RSA, as I said. So I already explained you how it works. But again, if you have questions, we can go a bit more into detail how these are computed. And I can share with you now the results. So first of all, so we use 3 different networks, and the 3 of them are trained on the 2 different tasks that I say, scene classification and scene parsing, and we also compare to randomly initialized weights as a baseline, okay? So this is important for understanding if the architecture has somehow a factor in there for the results. So is it because the architecture is of a particular depth or particular shape that the results are like this, or not, or is it consistent, the result, across different architectures? And these are just different names of different architectures. And here what we see when we compare to OPA, PPA, so the NAM is the behavioral model, is that definitely scene classification models and scene parsing models can predict the data of the different brain regions better than random. So it means that there is, so the learning of these models, so the task that they have been trained to really has some impact. And not always we see a significant difference of how they can encode the brain data in the different areas, okay? So it seems that in principle with this technique, we don't see much difference between the 2 models. So we wanted to go a bit deeper because, of course, scene classification and scene parsing are tasks that are very entangled, so they are very related and all have to do with scene, and it could be that there is a lot of overlap of the information. So what we did is use variance partitioning to kind of go a bit deeper and see if there was a model that would explain the brain data uniquely better than the other, okay? And here again, this is a slide that explains you how this is done, but I won't go into details because we don't have a lot of time, but yeah, this is also explained in the paper and there is a lot of literature about this. We didn't invent that. So here in the results, so again, each of the plots that you see from left to right are the different architectures that we use. In the top row, we see the results taking the best layer for each of them that can explain the data, the brain data, and the other one is taking the whole model, okay? So you take all the layers and then, so again, so the first notable result is that the model with random weight, so the one that has not been trained at all, doesn't have much to explain here, let's say. So it's really low, the variance, the uniquely variance that can explain. And what is interesting is that here in this case, the scene parsing explains more uniquely the brain data than scene classification. So it seems that to our original hypothesis, if we take this other approach, so we can see that actually, in fact, the structure of the scene is important to explain these brain areas. And again, we also took the behavioral model for a comparison. Another thing that it's something that you can do with these models. So as I told you, now we know that these DNN models that are trained for scene classification are not as good as the ones trained for scene parsing for explaining the different brain areas or the scene brain areas. So we can take the output of the result, because before we didn't take the output, we actually took the layer that explained better or all the model, right? So it's not the actual labels. But here you can take the output, so the actual structure in the image, and see how each of these components, scene components, so for instance, floor, wall, and ceiling, that's the ones we took, because that's the ones that are more structural for the scene. So how are these encoded in the different brain areas? So I'll start with the NAM, which is the behavioral model. So here, not surprisingly, floor is the one that correlates better with the behavioral model, because people, when they outline the images for the places where they think they could navigate, of course, it's always on the floor. So there is a high correspondence here, and a bit of the ceiling. And here the intuition is because usually ceiling and floor are kind of parallel. So there could be that there is something here. And for the rest, in most of the cases, floor was more encoded in OPA. And also this makes sense with the previous findings and with the previous conclusions of the literature, that OPA is more related to navigational affordance because you navigate through the floor, right? And in PPA, the RDMs with wall and floor are the ones that actually encode more information and more than the ceiling RDMs. And this also kind of makes sense because PPA is usually thought to be more for the structure of the scene, at what kind of scene it is, so that the fact that there is also the wall there encoded, it could be because of the structure, but also because of the textures and so on, that gives you this kind of information, okay? Yes, and for the behavioral, I already told you. So as a conclusion, I just want to summarize very quickly for you. So scene parsing models explain responses in scene selective regions uniquely better than scene classification model, as we saw in the results. So what we can say is that the task that the DNN is trained for is very important when comparing with the brain data, okay? So we can not only use this AlexNet trained on ImageNet, but we really have to think about which kind of data and which kind of objective function we used for optimizing the parameters of the model. So this can lead to a follow-up question, which is the following. Can we use a set of DNNs that perform a diverse set of tasks to find a functional organization of the visual cortex? Okay, so not only a particular scene area or object area, or IT, which is the one that is usually studied, but go a bit beyond. And we focus on the visual cortex only. So if we assume that we have no knowledge about any function of a particular brain area, so can we gain insights using this kind of approach with the different models? And of course, we need to check if the results are consistent with the previous literature to see if this kind of methodology actually can be helpful or not. So here you can see an outline of how can we do this. So we have the stimulus set. We actually use the same one that we had before from the indoor scenes. And then we have this recorded data with fMRI of people watching the images. And we use a set of DNNs, which are trained on different vision tasks. So for instance, with texture, with edges, to predict the 3D, the layout of the scene, which object is present there, scene classification, so on and so forth. Okay, so for each particular brain region, now if we do RSA, we can get a ranking, or we can also do a searchlight analysis. So one can say that this is a bit of a fishing expedition, but with several constraints. So one of the constraints that we have, for instance, is that all the DNNs have the same architecture, so we can factor out this variable. For instance, they have been trained with the same kind of images, so we can also factor out the data set that has been used for learning the parameters, and the only thing that changes is the actual task and some parts of a bit technical here, the decoder, because one needs to adapt to the output, but this is something technical. You can also ask me about it later. Okay, so for this, as I said, we use the same kind of brain data that we had before, and for the models, we used one set of models that are given with what's called a taxonomy data set. So they give a bunch of indoor images, more than 1 million, and then a set of models that have the same architecture. And here you can see the output of what the models predict. So different vision tasks, especially for indoor scenes. And here, one other thing that I wanted to say is that for this particular brain data, indoor scenes were used. So it was also important that the models were trained on indoor scenes to kind of have some match in the statistics of the data. We also use RSA in a similar fashion as before. And as the first check, this is more like a kind of sanity check. So you can take the first layers of all the models and find how much they can explain the early visual cortex. So it is known that the early visual cortex, it kind of encodes edges and this kind of low-level information of the images. And it is also known that the models, no matter to what task they have been trained on, but on images, of course, they also encode these kind of edges and low-level information. So here what we see is that when we take the first layers of these models and find the correspondence or how can they explain their early visual cortex, so all of them explain equally well this brain area. So this makes sense. But when we go to the deeper layers, and also find this explainability to the early visual cortex, what we see is that really the ones that are trained for 2D tasks, so for instance, detecting edges and so on, are the ones that explain better the data. So this can also give us an insight that this methodology can actually work, because we find this very nicely here. And as I said, this is kind of a sanity check that we did too, because this was already known. So we can do the same, but now taking the last layers of the models, because this is where the task-specific information is encoded, and find the correspondence to OPA and PPA. And here, what we can see is that the models that are encoding 3D tasks, like 3D edges, means that really is the edges that have some kind of boundary. It would be not in my face, but between my shoulder and the wall, for instance, right? So this 3D is more related to OPA. So this is also nicely aligned with the fact that you need to know the layout for navigational affordance, for instance. And for PPA is more the semantic kind of tasks. So the models that have been trained for scene classification, semantic segmentation, and so on. Okay. So this is also consistent with previous neuroimaging studies that they didn't use this kind of models, but other techniques like behavioral models or other kind of models. And we also did some variance variance explained with this top 3D, and we also have a consistent results. I'm going to go a bit quickly here because I'm running out of time. So now what we can do is also, instead of going to particular brain area, we can also do like a search light analysis and do an unbiased search. So only taking particular search like spheres and see if the results make sense or they are scattered and all random across the brain. So here what we see are the results. So here, this is only qualitative results. So we didn't do any statistical testing here because we have a lot of models. So we only pick up the one that explain better a particular searchlight sphere. But what we can see is that the results don't look random, right? So they kind of, and also they look quite a lot of what you would expect with ventral dorsal and so forth for the organization and the functional organization of the brain. To have a bit more quantitative results, what we did is group the models of 2D, semantic, and 3D. So now we only would have 3 models and then have this kind of results. So again, the results look quite smooth, and also it makes sense of what we got. So the 2D representations are formed first in the early visual cortex in a kind of hierarchy. It's followed by semantic and 3D in the deeper areas of the visual cortex, and then we can also have a kind of ventral dorsal interpretation of the functional map in this way. We also did a similar analysis taking different brain areas, so ROIs of the brain, and yeah, to also have this kind of interpretation, but with the particular brain areas and not only with the searchlight analysis. And yeah, so the results are also consistent with what I told you before. Let me see if I have time. So, okay, I'm running out of time. This was kind of the bonus. I just mentioned it very quickly. So all the experiments and all the data that I've presented today was using fMRI data of humans watching the images. So we did a set of experiments with EEG. So you can also have information with more temporal resolution in this way and do a very similar analysis. So here I just give a lot of details of how we do the experiments, but the bottom line, you can have it here, is that what we found is that the 2D models shows the earliest peak when finding this correspondence with the EEG data. It's followed by 2D and semantic DNNs, and then the peak for the behavioral model is the latest. And here the intuition could be that all this information is gathered all together to then somehow reason about the navigational affordance, for instance. Yeah, sorry, I went very quickly over this, but again, you can ask me later, or you can send me an email and I can share more information. So just as a final conclusion, so the correlation between the DNN models with the brain area, and this would be with the fMRI data, and the time response with the EEG data. So we can have both modalities, depends on the task the DNN has been trained on. So this is very important. And we can gain insights of the functional role in each brain area or time based on what the DNNs have been trained on. And we can use these DNNs models as a potential alternative to gain insights for assessing this brain areas function, as I said. So what one can do now, so consider, of course, more fMRI data sets with more brain areas, consider more complex tasks than single static images. And this is what leads just a bit of advertising here. So I was talking to you about the Algonauts project. So actually, 2020 was canceled, so now we do 2021 together with CCN. There's a typo here, CCN, so Computational Cognitive Neuroscience Conference. And the submission deadline is quite early, so maybe you still have time, but there will be a session 7th of September. So here what we do is we provide fMRI data of humans watching videos. So 3-second clips on each a large data set, 1,000 videos. And we use encoding models to get the variants explained and then build the leaderboard and see who is the winner and who proposes the best model. So with this, I'll finish, and yeah, thanks all here. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask.